Chairwoman Williams, welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come before you all. Again, this is like my favorite committee. Truly, it is my favorite.
You say that to all the committees.
No. Trust me. I believe in giving credit where credit is due. And I look at the committee and I see some grand individuals and individuals that I consider friends, genuine friends. I'm here today with regards to House Bill 5354. It's a House resolution. It's creating a special legislative commission to study the health and safety impact of revising commercial sexual activity laws. Now, I am confident that the title alone of this House resolution for a study commission have drawn concerns to maybe a couple of yous. I won't say all of yous. But I want to just say to you that, Representative Almeida, please take your seat. Where are you going? I want everybody to hear, including you, please. Thank you. I want to assure you that this is a study commission. This is something for conversation. This is a topic that needs to be discussed, needs to be talked about. Grown folks conversation. And for some folks, some grown folks, it's a squirmy-ish topic, sex. Now, we all like it. I know there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. But I don't think there are enough of us bold enough, open enough to talk about it. Openly talk about it. Have a grown folks conversation about these topics. Just to derail a little bit, when it comes to conversation about race, many of you don't want to talk about it openly. You prefer to talk about it in your comfort zone. I'm asking you to please not only listen to me and others that are here to present the information, very important information, factual information to you about this study commission. But I'm asking you to hear what is being said. Many times we tentatively sit down and give a little smile and make believe. But I'm asking you respectfully today to hear what is being presented to you. We often react after the fact. I consider Rhode Island one of those states. After something happens, many of us run to the forefront to try to come up with a solution or something to address it. That is not the proper way to do things. We need to be ready at all times. At least try our best to be ready. Now, I don't want you to be afraid to discuss this. I've talked to a couple of my colleagues with regards to, let's have a dialogue. I want to hear your thoughts and your opinion, your belief, your way of life with regards to this subject. I guarantee you this is not a slippery slope. In no way, shape, or form. When talking to one of my kids, trying to explain the concept, the intent, the response was, you're talking about friends with benefits. Oops, is that what it's called? But that was an inside family joke. But this commission is going to look at several areas. And for me, there's not going to be no holds barred. And what I mean by that is I want to hear it all. I want to hear, but I also want you all to listen and hear what the experts have to say. I want you to listen carefully. But I also ask you to please ask the questions. I don't care how embarrassing they are, because I'm confident that there may be, or there are, constituents of yours who have these questions that may be burning on your lips, but you're concerned about saying or asking them simply because you're concerned about what you're going to be perceived to be. What type of person? What is this? Why would he act? Is he or she doing this? What's going on? So I say all that just to say to you, no question, as our teachers used to say, is a foolish question. I have, as an elected official, as a woman in the community, I have seen the shift of law enforcement behind prostitution, behind the acts and or the treatments of law enforcement on women, but more so the hardship and the ill treatment on women of color. All the time. I grew up seeing it. I still see it today. What did I just say? We react. Don't we have legislation addressing what some officers have been doing to women that have been picked up, and before they get to the station? Look, we know the real deal, but we need to should be mature enough to talk about it. We just can't just overlook it because it's a sexual conversation. We need to talk about this. I know that also a concern with regards to having this conversation, it is been perceived and presented that human trafficking is going to be given the approval of occurring. I am very concerned about human trafficking. The women, the men, transgender, our teenagers, our little kids, trust me. But we cannot continue to address those things after the fact or come up with policies to deal with that situation at hand. We need to work on solutions that's going to address these problems or concerns long term. So in order to be able to come up with some sound solutions, we have to talk about them. Pro and con, good or bad, men and women. We need to bring it out on the table and discuss it. I would even take the risk to say, I don't think any of you that are listening to me right now here in this room are prudes. And I'm not asking to be inside of your household, your bedroom, your closet, or your automobile, whatever makes you float your boat. No, not I. It's your stuff. But you have to understand that it's a conversation that needs to be had. And this commission is going to bring the facts. It's going to bring the facts to the table so that we can address the issues head on. We won't have to assume. Now, we may not get it right 100%, but by talking about it, by presenting the facts, by definitely looking at the issue head on, we will be able to come up with sound solutions. I know that when we talk about marginalizing individual, oftentimes because it doesn't affect, I'll say the majority of you, the only one who probably have been in that category would be Representative Almeida. So because of that, or one of those things, being marginalized, being put to the side, being categorized as less than by virtue of being a person of color. Worse, if you're a woman of color. So, by virtue of not having that direct on-hand experience, if you hear it from those that have had that direct impact and experience, you get to learn something. But it's not a one-way street, because your assumption that may have been in the past now becomes important, because you would share that information to that person who's sharing theirs with you. No one, absolutely no one, should be afraid of having a study commission. How many of them that they're always putting forth in this General Assembly? We come up with study commission all the time. This is not an ask to pass a bill to legalize prostitution in the state of Rhode Island. This is a bill, this is a resolution that I'm asking for so that we can present factual documentation on prostitution, on sex, on human trafficking here in the state of Rhode Island. When we talk about let's do a commission to study the disparity on race, anytime it comes about anything to do with real life situation in the community of color, in the low-income communities, and the injustice in those communities, it's not even a second thought, it's always put forth for study commission. Well, this is no different. This is an area that we need to also study. I'm saying to you all, there are some experts that are from different states that are going to come before you, even as far as New Zealand, that have been dealing with this matter, the expert, 32 years. That's about how old I am, but nevertheless, the individuals that are going to come before you are coming with facts from other states that are also dealing with this situation. We should not be left out because we are sensitive to talk publicly about something that's really happening and it's been happening in our state for years. Now, again, I will say to you, please keep an open mind to everything that's going to be brought forward here today. And to also remember that this is a study commission so that we all can become more educated on the facts that's occurring today in our state. This is only one of many things we need to be talking like grown folks. But this is what I'm asking you to please consider, to listening to the facts. Thank you. Oh,
Thank you, Chairman Williams.
let me just also
Sure.
add, the Attorney General is also supportive of participating in reviewing all of the factual information, so it's not just us.
Okay, thank you. Any questions of the sponsor? Yes.
I just want to be put on the record. I support this. I recommend passage, and please try to get me out of this commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative.
Okay, then I'll call the first couple of witnesses. I understand there's a couple of people who have to catch a train at 7. So Julian Modzelewski, I hope I didn't mispronounce that name terribly, and Kate Mongoluski. Oh, I know you did, yeah. If it doesn't have a Mick in front of it, I can't pronounce it, you know.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the committee for having us tonight. Sorry about the train schedule. We didn't realize that we would be following the doggy divorce conversation and that might take as much time. My name is Kate Mogilescu. I'm a professor at Brooklyn Law School in New York. I also am here in my capacity as the lead attorney for the American Bar Association Survivor Reentry Project, which is a project of the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. The Survivor Reentry Project looks at survivors of human trafficking that have criminal records across the country because of their victimization, either in the commercial sex industry or in other labor sectors, and looks at state law in this area, Rhode Island being one of the states that actually offers relief for survivors of human trafficking with criminal records, to see how we can improve the process for survivors of human trafficking that have criminal records. Over the last decade, I have represented well over 1,000 people who have been arrested for prostitution offenses in New York City. So I'm very familiar with how the policing of the commercial sex industry impacts people arrested for prostitution offenses, profiled as being involved in prostitutions, and survivors of human trafficking who are arrested. And so here tonight, like many other people who are going to speak after me, I am here to support House Bill 5354. And when Representative Williams said this is something that people don't want to talk about necessarily, I think the national landscape has really shifted on that. And what we're seeing across the country is a real interest and need in examining our laws that govern the commercial sex industry, because there is such overlap with issues of sexual violence, human trafficking, exploitation, and also marginalization of the communities that Representative Williams discussed, right? People of color, transgender individuals, people who have existed in poverty and are living in cycles of poverty. The very people that in so many other capacities and all the work that we do, we are trying to support and assist. This bill would allow Rhode Island to explore this issue pragmatically, would allow you to move forward with the proper foundation of data and information. We have started this conversation in so many states, and too often what you see are policymakers and lawmakers rushing to create policy without that information, and that can ultimately be very harmful, right? Tonight, even alone, in addition to talking about slippery slopes, we've talked about unintended consequences of laws. And that's something that we really have to think about when the stakes are as high as they are for people in the commercial sex industry who are facing arrest. So to me, when I was asked to take a look at this bill and to compare it to what's happening across the country, I was very happy to see that the approach was logical, it was cautious, it was reasonable, and it was a way to really get the information about what's happening on the ground before taking a position or thinking about law reform. Law reform is probably necessary in some way. Every state in the country is grappling with this right now. But what we know, particularly from looking at our work with criminal record relief for survivors of human trafficking, is that this is an area that's going to get scrutiny. Just last month, I co-authored a report with the Polaris Project, which is one of the most predominant national human trafficking organizations in this country, that graded all of the states on their criminal record relief laws for survivors of human trafficking. Rhode Island didn't fare very well, but don't worry, many states didn't. New York certainly didn't fare much better. But this is an area that has national attention and that we're going to continue to see receiving attention, so we need to be smart about it. and I believe that this bill is a smart approach. I'm happy to let my colleagues speak a little and take any questions also.
Any questions for the witness? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Good evening. My name is Jillian Modulewski. I am... Ears on? My name is Jillian Modulewski. I am a public defender with Brooklyn Defender Services, which is a public defender agency out of Brooklyn, New York. And you're probably wondering what a public defender from Brooklyn has to say about a House bill in Rhode Island. And it turns out there's a lot, but I will keep it brief. I wanted to just talk to you about something that New York has done to try to combat human trafficking. And I'm not saying this is not I'm not necessarily in favor of what New York has done, but this House bill would allow you to explore what New York has done and determine whether or not it is a good option for Rhode Island. And it would also provide information, I think, to other states to see if it is a good idea as well. What New York has done is created something called the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. It was created by judicial mandate in 2013. These courts were created to identify victims of trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, and connect them to services instead of putting them through the regular criminal justice system. What this means is any person who is arrested for prostitution-related offenses automatically has their cases go to this Human Trafficking Intervention Court. Cases usually result in dismissals after these women are connected with minimal and engaged with in minimal services. During my 5.5 years working in this particular court, I've seen that the courts lead to better results or case outcomes for the women who go through these courts. However, there are some issues with the courts. They have their drawbacks and they don't address major issues facing sex workers and victims of trafficking. And some of those issues that they don't address is the discriminatory policing practices by police departments who are arresting mainly Black and brown women, trans and cisgendered women, and bringing them into the criminal justice system. They do not address oftentimes harmful and violent behavior exhibited by police during arrests of sex workers. They also don't address the devastating consequences an arrest has on a non-US citizen and their immigration status. Finally, these courts, they don't address services that women actually need. The actual needs of these women include safe housing and immediate housing, and also job opportunities. And the human trafficking courts have not addressed those issues. I urge you to pass the House Bill 5354, and in doing so, you would be able to study trafficking courts and determine whether or not this is a good way to address what's happening to sex workers and to human trafficking victims. I'm happy to take any questions about the trafficking courts in New York.
Any questions for the witness? Yes, Joe.
Thank you. For the public defender.
Yes.
I got a couple of questions. One, is there a special police squad assigned to this court?
Not a special police squad. Typically, the vice squad, which investigates and polices prostitution, will do the raids of the massage parlors where a lot of my clients are being arrested, as well as they will watch essentially the places where prostitutes and sex workers typically are on the street. It's the vice squad that's usually in charge of doing these raids and investigations.
And that I understand, but let me reword that. Is there a special squad? I don't think I'm using the right word, but is there a special squad that would work with, once arrested, then follow through into the court system? That's it. They just shuffle the case over to court.
Correct. They're just arrested and then
Nothing's changed.
Correct. From arrest to their arraignment, nothing has changed. The police arrest them, they charge them with a specific charge like prostitution or loitering for the purposes of prostitution, and then they are sent to the court to be arraigned. It's once they're at the arraignment and in the court that now their case is put into this special specialized court, the Human Trafficking Intervention
That's
Court.
kind of shameful. I mean, gang squads follow it all the way through into the court system here in Rhode Island. I can't.
We have looked into having NYPD come and talk to us about training their officers and identifying victims of trafficking and sensitivity training, but NYPD has been reluctant to take a seat at the table with us.
And the services in New York, right?
Yes.
All the social services, welfare, child, are they heavily involved in this?
No, not at all. We have individual organizations that come into the court and offer services to our clients, and we will work, depending on what the client needs. If it's a Mandarin-speaking client, we have organizations that will work with those clients. If they're transgender clients, we have organizations that work with them. Spanish-speaking, we have a lot of organizations that are in the court providing services.
And I guess my final question to the professor. So, do we have statistics? I mean, you, the public defender, just mentioned it, but women or men of color in prostitution. Has that been focused or talked about, or has anybody done anything about that?
So, I mean, what's interesting is that the commercial sex industry is actually quite diverse, and men, women, boys, girls participate in the commercial sex industry. The policing of the commercial sex industry is less diverse, and the policing of the commercial sex industry focuses on women of color. And that is played out in statistics across the country. In New York, we looked at 1,400 prostitution cases in 1 year, and we identified that 98% of people arrested identified as women. 89% of people arrested were people of color. So there are actually quite a few statistics that show the trends of policing. That is not necessarily representative of who is involved in the commercial sex industry, because that is a wide range of people. I would also point out one of the benefits of a potential study, in addition to recognizing that court initiatives exist across the country and need to be analyzed, is thinking about how to back up the process and get these community-based organizations in earlier. So in many places across the country, we're looking at pre-arrest diversion, right, where police are actually engaging with community-based organizations and doing non-arrest interventions with people in the sex industry that then avoid the harm of becoming court involved, which, you know, as Jillian mentioned, comes with a lot of collateral consequences. Obviously, we know this, but thinking about where we can back that up to make people safer, and you're going to hear, I think, more about this from witnesses that are coming, more willing to report violence when it occurs, when they experience it.
And I'll let you go at this. You said non-arrest is. First of all, you're talking to a former cop, okay? So you said I know, non-arrest, okay? What does non-arrest mean to you? I know what it means to me, but.
So non-arrest means that there's some interaction on the street, most likely.
Yeah.
And then the options are sort of set from different categories so that police officers are allowed to make referrals to public health centers, to medical care, to other community-based organizations that are on call. And, you know, in places where this has begun, what police forces are really kind of recognizing and beginning to think about is how this changes community police relations. And the ability to recognize, particularly for low-level offenses, and in most places across this country, prostitution is treated as a low-level offense, right? So we're not talking about incorporating violent offenses in this or more serious offenses, but for low-level offenses that a lot of police officers, I'm not going to speak for you and your experience.
I'm going, don't worry
yeah,
about
but
it.
a lot of police officers resent the arrest imperative on the low-level offenses because it's tedious, it's repetitive. They see that it's not working. They see that the underlying conditions that are leading to arrest are not being resolved in this way. So many law enforcement agencies across the country are actually excited to think about how can we reframe. And that's part of this conversation too. What it does then is it improves the community-police relationship to the point where, again, when the things that we are concerned about, the things, violence, sexual violence particularly, exploitation, right, when they occur, that people then are more likely to come forward and report that. And there's been an interesting experience with this in San Francisco on the municipal level, and I think you'll hear more about other efforts across the country tonight. But it's something that this commission would be able to really dig into and think about how that would work here locally.
And just for this great committee, for you all, because you already understand it. But for this committee, I ended my career in community policing. It's one of the best things going. It got to the point where I got to know how much of a balance somebody had in their checking account. So community policing is a good way to go. We did not back in that, when it first started, we didn't get involved in the whole issue of prostitution because we handle it a different way. But policing needs to change constantly, and I think this definitely will happen. We okay, Anastasia? Good. All right, good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
What time's your train?
7:25.
Okay, 6:52. So I've got one
Luggage is
question.
somewhere else, though, so
On
factor that in.
on the statistics, you mentioned the arrest statistics. How do those compare to the actual population of individuals involved in? So you're saying, do you understand what I'm saying?
So these are really difficult and thorny questions, and when you hear data in this area, you should always be very sort of cautious, right? Because there is no standard or uniform measurement of commercial sex activity across the country. The only measure we have is that which is policed, and that which comes into our court system is criminal. So what we know, though, is that if you peruse advertisements for commercial sex, or you think about who may be involved in commercial sex or who is and what the markets are, they look much different than who's policed, but there's no uniform data available on commercial sex activity across the board.
I will just say that in my 5 years of working in the human trafficking court, I've never had a cisgendered male client come through. There's never been an arrest for prostitution of a cisgendered male client for myself. It's only been trans or cis women.
And have you looked at, say, some of the European countries that, the participants, for lack of a better term, in that particular, in the arena there? Do you draw any conclusions between what goes on in Europe versus what goes on here to get an idea of what the real numbers are? Is that something you could possibly do?
I would hesitate to say that gets us at the real numbers, because again, I think it's a very difficult thing to measure. I think what you do see when you look at policing practices and arrest practices across the world is that same dynamic exists. So that does certainly corroborate that women of color, and poor women bear the brunt of this policing across the world.
Any further questions of the witnesses? Yes, Blake.
Is it mostly disparate impact or a racial bias? Because I'm trying to dig into the numbers, and I think statistics we need.
I mean, so
have
this
a
is a
little more
very complicated
information.
question, and I'm not going to be able to articulate it to the constitutional standards of whether this is disparate impact. I think policing, municipal level policing, right, focuses on certain communities, certain geographic areas, and that would lead to these disparities that we see. There's also a certain notion of who is working in the most vulnerable and exposed conditions. So people who work on the street, for example, right, versus people who have the ability to rent hotel rooms, to engage in higher end areas that are least likely to come in contact with the police. So there's a lot of different factors that determine who is even made visible to policing. And of course, that's deeply intertwined with race and class. So it's hard to pull them out in that way, I think.
So you can't say that two people who are practicing the same type of prostitution in the same type of area
Right.
would be treated differently based on their skin color. We can't say that, but we can look at the numbers and determine that maybe there's different activities going on amongst prostitution based on race.
I think, or just what's visible, yes.
Okay.
And what,
Areas that police are targeting.
Understand.
and an interesting statistic also just about New York is that, Jillian mentioned the policing of massage parlors. And this is something we've seen a huge increase of in New York over the last 5 years, and this is predominantly Chinese and Korean women. And so, right, that's not necessarily representative of who gives massage in this country, or who, right, that's not, it's just, again, what's visible, and therefore what gets policed. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to that, I think.
Thank you.
Any further questions of the witnesses? Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Very much.
Gail Harvey from Rhode Island Now. Susan Raza from the Women's Project, and Brenda Cointnor from the Women's Project. Are they here? No? Okay, yeah, then. Yeah, I know. All right, Gail.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I have to say, in all honesty, being from Brooklyn, although here for 20 years, I'm very proud that we had these two wonderful women. It was easy to see where I lived in Brooklyn who was working the streets and policing. I'm very aware of it. So I think their testimony is really important. But I'm here for Rhode Island now, this evening. Rhode Island Now's mission states that we believe that anyone who identifies as a woman deserves equality and equity in political, social, and economic arenas, which is why we have submitted a letter and are supporting this bill tonight. I think Representative Williams was so eloquent in what she was saying. This is a difficult subject, and it's not one that we talk about a lot. I'm old enough to, and live long enough to be a little about it myself. But the bottom line is, it needs to be discussed. We have people at the highest levels in our society that don't have any problem availing themselves of certain services, and they don't seem to suffer any consequence, but the person who is offered the services does. That's just wrong. But that's neither here or there. What this does, as you can see by reading this very good bill, it's creating a commission to study the impact of prostitution and sex work laws in the context of decriminalization. That's what you're talking about. We're not talking about somebody's sexual habits. You're talking about having a panel of people that are able to talk about this in a manner that you will get to some kind of conclusion as to where the state should be. So 10 years ago, the prostitution laws for sex inside was overturned. Did sex and prostitution go away? Of course it didn't. It never has. But how are we going to deal with it? So why not use the resources we have in this state? I'm very proud to be a Rhode Islander. I love my Brooklyn roots. But I'm very proud to be part of this state, and it's a state where you allow citizens to participate in government. I couldn't be here today if I lived in Brooklyn. I wouldn't be able to do this. So we are unique in the fact that we have the ability, by our size and the quality of people we have, that we can look at this problem. I'm not reading from my letter, I'm sorry. But this is important. This is democracy at work. You're not going to make sex go away. Women and people of color, it's always here and it always will be, but how do we want to handle it? And how do we want to handle it as far as the law is concerned? So we have Attorney General who believes in this. How are we going to handle it when we have healthcare people who understand what's going on? How are we going to handle it when we have women who are brave enough as sex workers to come forward and talk to you about it? So how, in good conscience, can we as citizens turn away from this and say, no, it's too difficult? It's way too difficult to ignore it. So I thank you for your time. There are many more qualified people to talk about this, but it's an important issue, and I have great faith in this committee. I've testified before this committee for about 5 years. We don't always agree on everything, but I think you will find your way clear to do this. It's a very easy thing to do. It's not difficult, and its rewards for the citizens of this state are big. And if we did something like this, we would be known for it nationally, and there's no reason not to be known nationally because we are a strong and good state. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Okay. Elena Shin, PhD from Brown. Oh, thanks. Dame Catherine Healy from the New Zealand Order of Merit. And Bella Robinson.
there's a different format because the three of us are. All right.
Each of you are going to testify, but
Thank you.
you're up, doctor.
Thank you so much.
Who's
hi,
that guy
everyone.
next to you?
This is Ray.
Hey,
Thank
Ray.
you, everyone, for entertaining Ray. My name is Elena Shi, and I'm an assistant professor of American Studies at Brown University, where I also lead a human trafficking research cluster through the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. I'm considered a global expert on migration, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and sex work. And I'm a former researcher with the United Nations Interagency Project to Combat Trafficking in China and a current member of the Rhode Island Advisory Council to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. But I recognize it's late, so I want to tell you an entertaining story. About a month ago, Cindy McCain was traveling through Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport, and she believes she witnessed an act of human trafficking and quickly notified law enforcement, who detained the passengers in question. Recalling the events on a radio show, she said, I quote, "I spotted it looked odd, a woman of a different ethnicity than her child, this little toddler she had. Something didn't click with me. I tell people to trust their gut. I went over to the police and told them what I thought. They went over, questioned her, and by God, she was trafficking that kid," end quote. McCain further tweeted about this incident to widespread acclaim, espousing a new belief in civilian vigilance to stop sex trafficking. And throughout the country and in our state, publicly funded human trafficking awareness trainings embolden everyday people like you and me and Ray later to call the police when they believe they've seen a sex trafficking crime. Right here in Providence, Rhode Island, a 2016 crackdown on Asian massage parlors was widely touted in the news media as rescuing victims of sex trafficking, but in our research, we learned that not a single worker was offered a T visa, the amnesty visa for victims of trafficking, and instead, all who were undocumented Korean workers were deported. When I teach about trafficking, we trace this moral panic against trafficking to the year 2000 with the passing of the United Nations Palermo Protocol and the subsequent United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, 2 decades in 2019, research has reported that time and time again, we must evaluate the harms and so-called unintended consequences that anti-trafficking policies have enacted on the communities that they intend to serve. And I'll pause to say that advocates argue that we can't even call these unintended consequences anymore, but that racialized policing is exactly what anti-trafficking laws hope to achieve. And that's why 5354 is so important, because so much of the fight to stop sex trafficking is morally as opposed to empirically guided work. And what do I mean by this? Rather than ask the people who are directly affected by and engaged with the sex trade what they think and what might help them, policing prostitution satisfies the emotional needs of the people doing the rescuing. And that brings me back to Cindy McCain. After police investigated the so-called case of trafficking that McCain had reported, they discovered it was not sex trafficking at all, but rather just a mixed-race family traveling together. So this blatant act of racial profiling in the name of identifying and rescuing a victim of sex trafficking has really become endemic to the policing of prostitution, as Representative Williams has said. So we stand before you with the audacity to advocate for what sex workers want, because we have actually asked them. In 2015, the American Sociological Association awarded a Community Action Research Initiative grant of $3,000 to Bella Robinson and myself. The funding supported a research study to understand the effects of policing for sex workers in Rhode Island. And as others will testify, Rhode Island is such a unique and important case because of the decriminalization of indoor prostitution prior to 2009. Our 2016 survey had 62 respondents, all cis women sex workers, and it revealed shocking evidence of the negative impacts of surveillance and policing on people involved in the sex trade. And this is actually an umbrella category that includes everyone from victims of sex trafficking on one side to consensual workers on the other, but also a wide swath of immigrants, low-income people, trans and gender nonconforming people, and people of color who have become ensnared in the web to stop human trafficking. People arrested for prostitution were less likely to trust medical professionals in the ER and reported less likelihood of receiving access
to homeless shelters. Over 72% of people we surveyed said if they were a victim of rape or sexual assault on the job, that they would be too scared to report this for fear of being arrested, fear that the police wouldn't take them seriously, or fear of drawing attention to themselves. 90% of people we surveyed said that they would not consider themselves victims of human trafficking, though nearly all agree that they face precarious economic and housing situations. A study in Rhode Island thus would be so appropriate, as extensive research globally has already detailed the intense fear and humiliation experienced by workers during undercover raid and rescue operations. In our last open-ended survey question, we asked respondents if there was anything else they'd like lawmakers and policymakers to know. One respondent wrote, quote, "Don't allow officers to have sex with sex workers and arrest them. That is rape. Allow sex workers to report being raped. Allow medical professionals to treat sex workers who are attacked without the pressure to report them to the police. Arrest and convict serial sex worker rapists without penalizing the sex workers," end quote. These comments point to harrowing experiences of living and working in the sex trade, but it is important to note that these experiences are not a part of sex work, but they are the byproducts of what happened when prostitution is policed. We urge you to consider supporting this study that would value the needs and perspectives of those most affected simply by asking them what helps, but ultimately, and more importantly, what hurts. Thank you.
Any questions for the doctor? Yes, Blake.
Thank you, Chairman. Because Rhode Island is so unique in that we had indoor prostitution legal before 2009 and then illegal after, have there been any studies that have data in terms of STD transmission, reduction or increase of rapes since 2009, increase or decrease of human trafficking since 2009? It just seems there would be a bevy of data out there,
Yeah,
which I'm just
absolutely.
curious if academics like yourself have parsed
Yes.
through.
So we have an economist who wrote one of the earliest papers looking at the data, Scott Cunningham, who's going to come and testify later. And then a subsequent research study we did on public health has some of that data, and we're going to have some people to speak
Before
to
we're
that as
done, we'll
well.
answer your questions.
We'll wait. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess the next one in order is Bella Robinson.
I am Bella Robinson. I'm the executive director of COYOTE, Rhode Island. I've been a sex worker for 35 years, so I think that you could consider me an old pro. I had my first prostitution arrest when I was 18 years old. It pretty much sealed my fate into the sex industry, even though they withheld the adjudication. And this is pre-internet. But it's really easy to find out this information by public record searches, and nowadays policing with splattering names and photos all over the internet, it really doesn't matter if you get that arrest vacated later, because anyone that hires you can Google it and find out. So obviously you're going to be discriminated against. Not only did we do this Rhode Island research, after we got that data, I was data hungry. We surveyed 1,515 sex workers across the country with 145 questions. And in your packet, there's a letter from Juliana Brown. She's at a conference, so she couldn't be here, but she wrote her thesis on the HIV and sexual health part. We found out sex workers had better condom use than the general public, but they were creating barriers because they couldn't be honest with their healthcare providers. Because we're training the public to snitch on sex workers and call it trafficking without asking the person. There's a huge gray area in between. When a person can threaten to out you and have you arrested, get you evicted, and have your children taken away, it gives all the power to the predators. Our demographics is much different than Rhode Island. Recently, one of our people are going to talk about the massage raids, but we're seeing it policed, mostly street-based workers, Asian massage parlors. The police are engaging in sex with people before they arrest them and seizing their money. So I want to talk a minute about all these services and diversions and getting the police involved. It's called law enforcement assisted diversion, where the officer decides if you get lead. It gives, I'm not saying all police officers are bad, but it allows corrupt police officers to use this leverage. What we have found out nationwide, and we've studied this really hard in Rhode Island with every service provider, is none of them provide any service but directing you to a public shelter like Crossroads. So they have the same service as anyone can get from 211. What we think can help reduce trafficking is increasing subsidized housing for poor women, LGBT halfway houses, youth drop-in centers. There's things that we can do on this commission that make sense, that will make everyone safer. But before I close, I want to tell you about my last arrest in New Jersey 10 years ago. I was 44 years old. I was working with another woman that's 44. If two sex workers work together, they'd be charged with felony pandering and promoting, and you can understand why they would be safer if there's 2 or 3 women working together. But the laws around it are made to make our lives more dangerous. So we're 44 years old, and a SWAT team kicked in my door to my home with a ram, without a warrant, waving guns. I felt like I was a terrorist and the military was coming in. I was jailed for 90 days. The judge made me pay a $3,720 fine, and when I told him I had a 17-year-old daughter, I had lost my house in the recession, he did the math and said, you're going to pay $310 a month for 12 months, or I'm going to issue you a warrant. So I was basically trafficked by the state of New Jersey's courts. And the best way to find out if someone is being exploited or harmed or taken advantage of is not to ask the lawyers, not to ask the police, is to ask them their experiences. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Any questions for the witness? Okay. Dame Catherine Healy.
Thank you for having me here. I flew from New Zealand, and of course you know that we cross a date line, but I had to fly back into the past. So
it's yesterday for you right now?
Or tomorrow.
But yes, it's interesting. It's May Day in New Zealand, and I want to reflect also on a personal experience, because before the Queen made me a dame, I had been a sex worker for a number of years, and it was May Day that I was also released from a court on a soliciting charge for sex work-related activities. So, but my role really in New Zealand has been to lead on the sex worker issue and to take the contract with the Ministry of Health, which we've sustained for 30-odd years, to lead the response to important issues related to HIV prevention, sexual and reproductive health rights and so on, as well as now in a post-decriminalised situation. New Zealand decriminalised sex work in 2003. We take the responsibility to ensure that sex workers have a relationship with government agencies, etc. So we broker a lot of relationships there with our contract with the Ministry of Health. They resource us, and I have to say I can reflect on 17 years of criminalisation and 17 years of decriminalisation, and we have a lot of evidence that we've gathered out of both of these different contexts. If you have a study commission, as everyone's explained before me, you will gather all that evidence as well, and it will deliver some kind of situation you can reflect on and project into your future response to sex workers. What we found was that we set up a committee after decriminalisation to review the impact of the legislation on the occupational safety and health and the rights of sex workers. And on that committee we had a chair who had been a police commissioner, we had a Catholic nun, we had 3 representatives who were sex workers. You get the picture, it was eclectic. The opinions were diverse. We had people who had opposed decriminalisation of sex work as well. And as a committee, it had to come to some kind of consensus and deliver a report back into the Parliament. The consensus at the end of that time was that they wouldn't roll back the clock. the recommendation was to keep decriminalisation. However, you know, political waves come and go, and there was a petition from people who were unhappy with decriminalisation. So there was another select committee that examined the issue again in the context of understanding the Swedish model, which, as we all know, is at, you know, Sweden's at the opposite end of the globe to New Zealand, and similarly on this issue, it opposes what we've done in our country and recommends a very different approach. Well, the Select Committee on that occasion examined very carefully what the Swedes had recommended, you know, prosecution of clients, criminalisation, you know, that kind of model, and rejected it. But the point I'm really trying to make is that there's nothing scary about examining, about having committees to look at these very tense issues, to bring in all the different kinds of points of view. So I strongly support this recommendation, and I hope that, you know, you have a successful outcome from it. And thank you for allowing me, someone who comes from the future, to speak.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions? Thank you. Okay, Philip Kahn, MD from Brown University, Scott Cunningham from Baylor University, and Megan Peterson from Brown University.
Who's first?
Welcome.
On? I think this is on, right? Yes.
It is,
Cool.
yes.
Great. Thank you for listening today and for being here. These are really complicated issues, and even just this listening does mean a lot. So my name is Megan Peterson. I've been working in outreach to people involved in the sex trade for over 5 years. I've worked previously as a harm reduction specialist, a certified HIV tester and counselor, and I currently coordinate a street-based sex worker-led outreach program here in South Providence. So I have spent a lot of time working with this population. Additionally, I'm a graduating Master of Public Health in epidemiology here at Brown. So criminalization of sex work affects human health and prosperity by exposing people to the criminal justice system. At Coyote, we outreach people who are involved in the sex trade and are at high risk for arrest. Many of our community members have described how experiencing an arrest impeded their social mobility, such as Bella, who told her story. For example, some have discussed how having a criminal record made it difficult to find employment or housing. So even in Rhode Island, where we have so-called ban the box legislation, which prohibits asking about criminal history in job applications, having one's legal name attached to a newspaper article or a police log detailing a prostitution raid can sink a job application after a quick Google search. So I wanted to talk about a recent community survey that we did where one participant stated about her job history. I think my past prostitution conviction would stop me from landing a good job. This is one of the reasons I have not bothered going to college and getting my degree, because the world will see me as a whore, so why bother, end quote. Others in our community have discussed how arrests cause them to be alienated by their peers, coworkers, and neighbors. One client recently discussed how after her photograph was shared by local news outlets, she received threatening text messages. Some of these were from a former romantic partner from whom she feared bodily harm. Many of our community members have discussed with us personal stories of how their involvement in the criminalized sex trade led to discrimination and subsequently deprioritization of health. For example, another participant in the previously mentioned survey talked about having stayed in a domestic violence shelter after being abused by her boyfriend. She said, quote, "I was treated okay at the domestic shelter until someone found out I was a sex worker. I was treated horribly after that, and I was told that I should try going to another shelter because they claimed me being there was upsetting the other women. I was not kicked out, but after a few days of listening to hateful gossip, I thought going back to my abusive boyfriend might be better than staying where I was not wanted." End quote. When stigma creates living conditions that are so unbearable for people that they would rather stay with an abusive partner than seek protection, our laws are actively harming women and their livelihood. I'd like to end this testimony by discussing how incarceration itself is associated with adverse health outcomes. As I mentioned, my background is in epidemiology, studying the effects of incarceration on public health outcomes. Although access to care is guaranteed in correctional institutions, the Urban Justice Center has found that many prisoners with pre-existing medical conditions did not receive treatment while incarcerated. Further, researchers at Stanford have found that although rates of substance use disorders are high among incarcerated populations, only 1/4 of people passing through the criminal justice system receive treatment for these conditions while incarcerated. Additionally, after people are released from incarceration, the post-release experience is very stressful. As we can imagine, people often have to coordinate re-entering social relationships. People may have to navigate a job that they abruptly left, or not having been available to take care of needs like maintaining their housing. As a researcher at UC Denver found that lack of social support after incarceration following the disruption of these relationships often led to increased likelihood of alcohol and drug use. Stigma can also have a major effect on health. It can act as a stressor that may be associated with negative psychological adjustments, help-seeking behaviors, and access to medical and social services. Many social scientists, for instance, have discussed how the process of disenfranchisement that people feel after incarceration has the ability to worsen individual health and exacerbate health conditions. I'm really proud to live in Rhode Island, which is a state that has a strong record of backing policies that are backed by evidence-based medicine. This bill is one step forward to a stronger, healthier state that does not punish people for victimless crimes. I urge you to pass this bill. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. You're up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Craven and members of the House Judiciary Committee. My name is Scott Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. I came today to support this bill. My background is economics, and I'm considered an expert on the economics of sex work. I've published 17 articles and book chapters since 2007, co-edited a book on the economics of prostitution with Oxford University Press, and have recently completed a new book on applied statistics for understanding the effects of laws. I want to share with you a little bit about two studies of mine that I think are relevant to this topic. In 2003, there was a judicial decision in Rhode Island that effectively constrained police arrests of indoor sex workers. And what me and my co-author, Manisha Shah, found was that after that decriminalization that occurred, reported rapes of females fell 30%, and gonorrhea incidents amongst women fell 40%. Now, we're not entirely sure exactly what's going on with the rape results. We suspect that this is decreased rapes of all women. What we think is going on with the effect on gonorrhea is that decriminalization led to safer behaviors amongst the sex workers, particularly the indoor sex workers. I want to tell you about another study of mine that I think is still relevant, and it concerns the rollout of an online platform called Craigslist Erotic Services that entered cities at different points in time from 2002 and 2009. What we found is that when Craigslist opened its erotic services in those cities, female homicide rates fell 10%. We find no effect on male homicides. We find no effect on domestic violence. We find no effect on manslaughters. This is just reductions in female homicides. And the best that we can tell is that it's leading women, sex workers, to move off the streets and go indoors where they have the ability to screen clients beforehand and eliminate some of the violence that they face under criminalization. I'm a professor I believe strongly in knowledge. I think that knowledge about policies and knowledge about the world are very important for creating good laws. And I think that nothing bad, only good things can come from sitting around and just studying what we know about decriminalization. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you both very much. Okay, Yeon-Hoo Chu from Brown University, Melana Krangel, and Diana Turaz, or something like that.
Tavares.
That's a V? Looks like a U. All right,
Hi.
welcome, welcome.
Thank you, honorable members of committee, for this opportunity to speak here, and thank you, Representative Williams, for sponsoring this House bill. My name is Yeon-Hoo Cho, and I'm an undergraduate student of Brown University studying sociology and migrant outreach project manager for COYOTE-RI, Rhode Island. I'm here to express my wholehearted support for this House bill in solidarity with local sex workers, particularly the 13 Korean women, female sex workers who got arrested last month in Pawtucket. Today, I would like to talk about my experience as an outreach worker as part of COYOTE-RI, Rhode Island, with the leader, Bella Robinson, who's here today. For the past year, since September 2018, I would drive across the entirety of Rhode Island to visit Asian spas and massage parlors with an aim to build relationship with the Asian migrant sex workers and to communicate about the resources they might need. This has been a lengthy process, I must say, which entails not only translating COYOTE's materials in 3 different languages, including Korean and Chinese, but also establishing a nuanced work ethic regarding how to approach the workers with respect and sensitivity. When I visited a number of massage parlors and spas, including the ones in Pawtucket that got raided last month, I did not see any sign of trafficking. My observation is in stark contrast with the recent media coverage about the police raids and arrests, with its narrative that views these women as either sex trafficked victims or sex trafficking pimps and nothing in between. When I spoke to the Korean women in those spas, they seemed extremely concerned about being found out not just by the police, but also by non-governmental service providers like myself, because of the active criminalization and stigmatization they face. It is truly unfortunate that the recent raids on the 2 Pawtucket spas completely nullified and undermined our outreach efforts. To clarify, some of our outreach goals are to minimize the harm done to the migrant body workers by providing immediate resources, and also to open an opportunity in which these women can voice themselves in the process of legal reformation. It seems that the police sees and wants quite the opposite. When they say they were protecting the neighborhood, we need to pay close attention to who they consider as neighbors that deserve protection from whom. As a woman of Korean descent and avid advocate of gender and labor justice, it is impossible to look away from such deplorable situation. As much as I acknowledge that sex work does provoke a lot of complicated feelings, I believe the current legislation that criminalizes sex workers needs to be reformed. And I believe that the House Bill 5354 will be an effective stepping stone to making amends. As a student who is still in progress of learning, I do urge everyone in this room to understand the importance of educating oneself and to make decisions based on appropriate empirical knowledge and evidence. Thank you for listening.
Any questions for the witness? Okay, next.
Thank you very much for your time. My name is Melana Krangel. I'm currently a senior at Brown, concentrating in ethnic studies. I am the founder of the Milana Krengelb Zine Collection, which I still can't believe is named after me. That's wild. And it is in the John Hay Library and associated with the Pembroke Center for Research and Teaching on Women and the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender, both at Brown University. I started the collection about 4 years ago and have since gone on to be a nationally recognized expert in zine culture, and zines are independently published magazines. And I especially got an interest in sex worker written zines because I was really determined to provide the university with materials that were of populations that were being ignored. I came in as a person really dedicated to learning history of people whose histories were not in my high school textbooks. And I found that even in the halls of Brown University, there were many histories that I could not access. And I wanted those histories to be available to myself and other people, especially those most affected. And I can see a trend in sex worker written zines. So these are the voices of people directly, of increased violence, especially after the federal FOSTA-SESTA bill. There's fear. There is a call for decriminalization, and there is a sense of hopelessness about legislators not listening to people, and that's now the narrative that's being archived, and I want a different narrative to be in the halls for eternity or what have you. I want my children, the future people at Brown, to look back on things and say, oh, this is the positive things that we have done. Look at the changes that we have, because I don't want it to be all pain. It's really harrowing to read all these stories and see that there's such easy, often easy fixes, but see so many people not getting listened to. And I'm currently archiving COYOTE-RI, Rhode Island's collection and Bella Robinson's collection, and it's so beautiful to see those stories finally get a voice. And I think a commission like this can really provide that for people, and a study is a perfect way to do that. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions? All right. You're next, Diane?
Yes. Thank you to the committee for listening to all these testimonies and providing your time. I'm speaking out in support of House Resolution 5354. My name is Diana Tavares. I'm an undergraduate student at Brown University and will be working as an investigative analyst for the Human Trafficking Response Unit for the Manhattan DA's office starting this summer. Okay. I am fully in support of this resolution. As a student researcher, I believe that research is absolutely necessary for proper and effective policy implementation. My work with human trafficking began as I interned at Polaris and subsequently wrote my senior thesis on their Latina sex trafficking initiative. Through this process, I engaged in ethnographic research through attending human trafficking trainings hosted by nonprofit organizations here in Rhode Island, as well as interviews with undocumented migrant sex workers. Through my research process, I gleaned that there was inherent racial bias in the policing of these migrant sex workers and a critical lack in research and fundamental understanding of trafficking on part of these nonprofit organizations. I can say that Polaris and their National Human Trafficking Hotline utilizes very faulty data in that they will list a mistaken call to the national hotline number as a trafficking case. And in addition to that, utilize this national hotline data to compile reports such as, for my initiative, the More Than Drinks for Sale reports. In these reports, then, they use this faulty data in order to garner millions of dollars of government funding in order to push policy that increases policing, in my case, of migrant sex workers. In the case of Polaris, they believe that this is the best way to end human trafficking and sex trafficking. However, when speaking with undocumented migrant sex workers, I learned that this was very violent, very harmful, and very coded in racialized and gender dynamics. I spoke with an undocumented sex worker who stated that the police told her she was a victim of human trafficking and then did nothing. This was a multiple instance situation in which she was told by nonprofits, domestic violence shelters, and police officers that she was a victim of human trafficking. However, there were no steps that were offered to her. It was just left at that. In addition, through my interview process, I gleaned that, well, I didn't glean, my interview participant told me that many domestic violence shelters had really no idea what human trafficking is. They were offered human trafficking trainings on part of these organizations who push these policing policies and then don't really, and then you have these organizations who don't really understand what trafficking is, and then they just cause violence. So I was able to, through my research process, really critique and get at the racialization and genderized dynamics, as well as the policing that is present in trafficking initiatives. I've done work in both trafficking organizations as well as with sex worker organizations. I believe that they're very disparate, not disparate, separate issues, and I have experience in both. So I believe that research is absolutely necessary. Without it, you get faulty data, and faulty data is then pushed and used to implement ineffective policy measures. I'm fully in support of this bill. I think research is a necessity, and the study of these laws are integral to the safety and health of sex workers.
Thank you. Any questions for Diana? Okay, thank you all for coming.
May I add something?
You sure?
Thank you. You had such a happy look when you said that. What Professor Shi was talking about with the case of the mixed race family, that has happened to me. My family is a multiracial family. That's not just a picked up news story. That's something that happened frequently in my life, and my mom is Black and she's frequently profiled as a sex worker. My mom's an occupational therapy assistant, and it goes beyond sex work and into and who is a sex worker into who is being stigmatized. And obviously we need to support sex workers and people who are homeless and people of color and how these all intersect. But there's also something to be said for how this research could also affect people who are perceived to be sex workers and decrease stigma across the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jimmy.
I believe you said the Pawtucket raid at the massage parlor?
Yes.
The people were deported? Or
No, they were arrested 28th of March, and
Okay.
I think it's still on being
Were they
investigation.
legal, or were they migrant sex workers?
They were charged with prostitution, unlicensed spa, and pandering, but there weren't any cases of problems with immigration status.
Immigration status. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Jill McCracken, Melissa Brando, and Rachel Jarosz. Is Rachel here? No? Okay, then, is Ryan Holt here? Ryan. Oh, welcome.
Thank you so much.
There you
Okay,
go.
there we go. Sorry
Thanks.
about that. First of all, I just wanted to thank our sponsors, obviously Chairwoman Williams, as well as Representative Agello, Representative Vela Wilkinson, Representative Almeida, and Representative Walsh. I'm going to be very quick. I know it's a late night. You're hearing from a lot of people. My name is Melissa Bruto. I'm an attorney and a longtime activist and advocate for all people in the sex industry, whether they're by choice, circumstance, or coercion. I've done direct representation of survivors of human trafficking, and I've also done policy work that actually began while I was an undergrad at Brown almost 20 years ago. So it was particularly exciting to see new crop of students. But I know you're hearing from a lot of folks, so I just wanted to voice my support for this critical legislation and yield to my fellow speakers. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jill McCracken, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee. I know it's been a long time, so thanks for listening. I'm here to speak in support of the bill. I'm a professor of rhetoric and gender and sexuality studies at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. I've been researching prostitution, sex work, and trafficking in the sex industry for the past 15 years. And I began this research to better understand how we can reduce violence and exploitation in the industry. That was my primary goal. If this commission is approved, we can collate and enhance our evidence-based research. You all have the opportunity to do that, which is very exciting, and it's desperately needed in the U.S. My first book, Street Sex Workers Discourse, was based on my research with street-based sex workers. And under criminalization, which I know you've heard a lot about, prostitution is currently pushed into the shadows. It actually creates the conditions where tremendous abuse, exploitation, and violence can occur. And that's what we want to learn more about in the study. Within the U.S., specifically the U.S., we know very little about how alternative legislative systems might work in relationship to prostitution. During the fall of 2018, I was thrilled and very excited to spend 3 months in New Zealand on a Fulbright specialist grant. My goal there, the job of the Fulbright grant, was to look at a legislative system and to better understand its impact on violence and trafficking in the sex industry. I'm only going to note one finding in particular. None of the sex workers I spoke with had experienced any violence at the hands of police. That was astonishing to me. They found that they had the impetus and the reason to go forward if they were experiencing some kind of abuse or coercion, and many of them had gone to the police, and they had direct relationships with speaking with the police. Street-based sex workers would actually say the police would come by and do rounds and say, hey, how you doing? And they'd say, we're doing okay. So they felt comfortable going forward. That was an amazing study that I was able to do, and I think that we have the opportunity here to do the same kind of study, right? As other people have said, much of the research has not had sex workers and victims of trafficking at the forefront, and that's what this commission does, and I think it's incredibly important. You guys have the opportunity, excuse me for my not proper English, you all have the opportunity actually to be a foreleader and come in the forefront in terms of fighting trafficking. You guys can actually take a stand and say, let's look at this. Let's look at our laws and how they not only impact sex workers, adult consensual sex workers, but victims of trafficking. So I urge you to support this crucial legislation, which would lead to discovering best practices and perhaps implementing them here in Rhode Island and hopefully in other places. We all want the full realization of rights for all persons, especially the right to freedom from violence and exploitation. Thank you so much for your time and consideration of this important issue. I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions for the doctor? Okay, thank you. Ryan, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Holt. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs for Attorney General Nerona. We are supportive of this resolution and the study commission that it would create. We think it's important to have evidence-based approach to lawmaking, hear from stakeholders, hear from others, and that this issue is worth taking a closer look at. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Any questions for Ryan? Okay. One question for you, Melissa. What is SOAR?
SOAR is the Sharmas Outlaw Advocacy and Rights Institute. We're a New York City-based advocacy, policy, and capacity building organization.
Thanks. Okay, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Steve Brown, Mike DeLauro, and Randall Rose. There's a lineup. Oh. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Stephen Brown, on behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island. I'm here to express our support for this resolution. I also am one of perhaps the few people who was here 10 years ago to testify against the law that was passed in 2009 that expanded the prostitution laws. Back then and before then, we've long argued for the decriminalization of consensual sexual activity. We continue to support that goal. And I recall the arguments that were given for passing the 2009 law expanding the statute, which was that it was designed to protect women. It was designed to crack down on human trafficking. And if anything, if we've learned anything in these last 10 years, it has not done that. And we certainly think that an empirical examination based on the testimony you've heard is really in order to make sure that if those are the goals of our laws in this area, that they're actually doing that. You've already heard a bunch of empirical data. I can't expand upon it other than to make one point. Just last month, we filed open records requests with urban municipalities in the state about their prostitution arrests. And I just want to give you two figures, one from Providence and one from Woonsocket. We obtained the records of all prostitution-related arrests for the past 3 years from those communities. In Providence, 94% of those arrests were of women. In Woonsocket, 89% of those arrests were for women. And this is supposedly based on a law that was passed in 2009 to protect women. So this definitely deserves study, and I hope you'll pass this resolution. Thank you.
Any questions for Steve Brown? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I don't think it's any secret that the Public Defender's Office over the years has become a huge fan of study groups, task forces, whatever they would call, to study and make recommendations for important criminal justice reforms and changes. We think when groups like that are made up of a diverse group of stakeholders as, wow, you think I'm a rookie at this. I'm not. We think that when stakeholders, which this bill, this resolution includes, come together, that great things can be done to make our criminal justice system work and function better. Some of the examples of those over the last few years have been the task force that this body created to address mistaken eyewitness identification, the task force that was created by this body to address the problem of false confessions by requiring that custodial interrogations be electronically recorded. A working group that Commissioner Perry put together. There was no legislation that created that group, but legislation was enacted as a result of that group's work that addressed the problem of racial profiling. As a result, we have one of the strongest racial profiling laws in the United States. And lastly, a group that has just commenced its work within the last couple of months regarding enhancing and improving discovery procedures in criminal cases. We think that when organizations and people of goodwill are brought to the table, that extraordinary things can and are accomplished. And let me just say thank you to Representative Williams and the sponsors for their thoughtfulness in including the public defender as a member of this commission. There's a good reason to create a commission like this, and I'm inspired to say that by the words that Representative Williams uttered a while back. This is a difficult and complex and uncomfortable issue. And the thing that's important to recognize is that reasonable minds can differ and do differ about the best way to approach the problem of sex trafficking and prostitution and the various public safety and public health issues that have been created as a result of our current laws. You've heard the experts say that some of the research that's been done, our current laws result in a increase in violence, exploitation, stigma, and that the work of this group could be to address those questions using the best available data and research and information. Finally, although there are a lot of moving parts to this resolution, and meaning that there are a number of things that a task force would be required to address, I was thinking this morning as I was preparing my testimony that two laws that were repealed just since I've been practicing law. First that I'll mention is possession of a needle and syringe. That was repealed maybe 10 years ago. I could be wrong. The reason that came about was because while we thought that laws like that protected society, what they really did is they made it more difficult to obtain needle and syringes, which increased disease and resulted in massive problems with tainted needles and such. The other criminal law that has been repealed, this goes back a little bit further, is the abominable and detestable crime against nature. You know, it's hard to believe that within recent memory that oral sex in Rhode Island was a crime. And Judge Wiley, I recall, wrote a decision declaring that statute unconstitutional, and then I believe it was repealed sometime later. So again, it's the same kind of thing. We're looking at changes in mores, we're looking at changes in society, and this body took action in that regard. A task force like this could make recommendations to this body that would take a little bit of the heat off, depending upon what its conclusions were, but in making thoughtful recommendations, again, how to improve public safety and public health. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions for Michael? Do you remember the last time that statute was prosecuted?
I'm hoping you didn't prosecute it, Mr. Chairman. But I suspect maybe...
Guess what the name of the case was anecdotally? The Brown University prostitution ring case.
I remember
Stanley
that
Henshaw.
one. Stanley Henshaw. I remember that. David Cicilline was the defense lawyer in that
The
case.
young David Cicilline with John Sheehan. Yep,
I heard they tried circles around you in that case.
They did.
Mr. Chairman.
they did.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I remember that case very well. I remember it very well.
And the irony is, given the context of what we're talking about here, its notoriety came from, because I was obviously the prosecutor, it came from the titillating nature of it being Brown University and not the fact that it was involving students who were being prostituted by a wealthy businessman,
So what I remember, the flip side of that is, I remember, and I'm not saying there's anything that, in fact, I'm quite sure this isn't something that you did as a prosecutor, but oftentimes in close cases where there were issues of identification or consent or the evidence was weak, the Attorney General would charge the abominable and detestable crime against nature because consent would not be a defense in that case.
Correct.
But the victim was never charged with that. So there were several cases where guilty verdicts were returned on that. People went to jail, and that can't happen anymore. So, but thank you for sharing that.
1989, so it wasn't that long ago.
It's not very long ago at all, Mr.
Not in our
Chairman.
lives,
No,
anyways,
it's certainly not. Thank you.
I know. Yeah, Okay, I think that concludes testimony on Chairman Williams' bill, House 5.